especially the dissertation committee members and Dr. Ning Wang. So in recent years, people have been massively exposed to a new kind of software engines that are called chatbots. In a general sense, chatbots are just software that interacts with humans using natural language, like the popular personal assistants that you might be familiar with, like Google Assistant or Siri or Alexa. But in this talk, I'm not going to focus on them. I'll talk about a specific kind of conversational technology that interact with humans using text-based environments like instant messenger tools such as Telegram, Instagram, Facebook Messenger, Slack, or Skype. So I'll give a couple examples of these technologies. This first one is Zoho. Zoho is a Microsoft multi-platform chatbot that talks to you about daily life topics, tell jokes, play games, that sort of thing. So it's more like a buddy kind of chatbot. This other one is Hipmunk. Hipmunk is a Skype chatbot that is designed to search flights for you. So it's task-oriented. And it tracks prices of the flights and notifies you when the prices change, that sort of things. And the list goes on and on. Actually, there are thousands of chatbots available for specific platforms, such as the ones that I showed you, like Facebook Messenger or Slack. And there are many others in companies' websites, like Dom for Domino's and Erica for Bank of America. And the chatbot market is actually very promising, especially if we consider the millennials. Recent reports show that 63% of the millennials reported that they are comfortable with non-human customer services, and 67% said that they would purchase products and services from brands using chatbots. So we're talking about a market that is estimated to grow up to billions of dollars by 2025. And we're even talking about a growing in the market that is above the marks for the personal assistants that I mentioned before. Now, the question is, are the chatbots good at what they're supposed to do? So since Alan Turing, the first generation of chatbots from Eliza to Alice, they were mostly designed to mimic human conversations, maybe impersonating a human. Advances in artificial intelligence, natural language processing and generation enabled the emergence of a new kind, smarter chatbots, like the ones that use the IBM's Watson technology. So there are tons of research that improves chatbots in the sense that they provide coherent and grammatically correct responses, actually understand the user intents, and have acceptable functional performance and accuracy. Despite all that, people are still not satisfied with their experiences with chatbots. And the point is that chatbots are designed to have at least one human characteristic, which is the natural language. But also, they sometimes, very often, they are designed to have social roles that are often associated with humans, like a tutor, a travel agent, a healthcare provider, and so on and so forth. So as we increase the human characteristics that we attribute to the chatbot, people are more likely to expect that the chatbot will follow conversational protocols, the social protocols. And because language is so important for human chatbot communication, chatbot's language should cohere with the user expectations and the social role that they are meant to represent. The point is that currently, chatbots often are designed with pre-recorded and handcrafted sentences that usually have arbitrary formality and style. There are no formal techniques to guide the designers in how to design the chatbot's language. And if we look at the human-human communication, there is actually a theory in social linguistics that defines how human-produced language varies across contexts. And this theory is called the register. Register defines, for example, that the words, tone, and formulations that I use for this talk is different from the ones I used when I wrote the dissertation, and different from the ones I would use if I was telling a friend about this talk. So what this theory establishes is that within a similar context, in a similar situation, different individuals will produce a language in a particular form, in a similar linguistic form. Now, the question is, can we leverage this theory to inform the design of chatbots conversations? So what I envision is that in the future generation of chatbots, what we're going to have is chatbots that have better social skills, and those social skills includes using appropriate language. So we imagine that chatbots should have the power to adapt their language to the particular social role that they mean to represent. And then in this research, I'll address this challenge to move towards this goal by answering the question, how does a chatbot's use of register appropriate language affect the user perceptions and experiences with chatbots? And because register is the most important predictor of language variation in human-human communication, I hypothesize that chatbot utterances that are register appropriate have a positive effect on user experiences. Now, the register theory associates the language variation to a particular context, to a situation. So we need to select a domain in which the chatbot will perform a role. And in our research, we chose the tourism domain. So the chatbot in this research, it performs the role of a tourist assistant that helps tourists to find information about a destination. Okay, so to achieve that goal, to answer that question, I proposed a 7 steps method that ultimately what we want to do is to present users with chatbot utterances that are written in different registers with different patterns of language, and we want to invite them to evaluate what language they would prefer would give them the best experience. Now, when we do this, we need to have sentences that have similar content, equivalent content. Otherwise, participants might be influenced by their satisfaction with the content, for example, and this is not really the goal. It's not what we want to evaluate. So we need sentences that have the same similar content, but expressed in different registers. And this sort of parallel data is very hard to find. There are research in the literature that use versions of the Bible or Shakespearean texts, but these are unlikely to be appropriate for the context of a tourism information search. So this method includes steps to collect data in the tourism domain, analyze and modify the language that are present in those data that we collected, and then produce this parallel data so we can perform the user studies using that. And I'll describe each of these steps now. So in the first step, I performed a literature review to find evidence of what social characteristics are pointed out in the literature as influencing the user experiences with chatbots. And perhaps I want to find some evidence that language is one of them, right? So I performed a survey in the literature that resulted in this conceptual model. This model has 11 characteristics, social characteristics for chatbots that are important for their user experience. They are grouped into 3 categories, and I also highlight benefits, challenges, and strategies to improve social aspects of chatbots interactions. But what I want to highlight here is this characteristic called thoroughness. Thoroughness is the ability of a chatbot to be precise and coherent regarding how they use language to express itself. So according to the literature, chatbots that are thorough about how they use language, they have better human likeness and believability, according to the participants in those researches. However, the evidence we found are mainly exploratory. There are no empirical evidence of these claims. And we did not find any strategy to improve chatbots' thoroughness. So that motivated us to pursue our goal and find evidence of the importance of thoroughness and chatbots' language use to the interactions. And introduce register as a theoretical foundation for chatbots language design. But we're talking about user experience, and user experience is a quite complex concept. So what I did, I searched the literature to find constructs aspects of the interactions that could potentially be influenced by chatbots language use. And I found 5 aspects of user experience that could be potentially influenced by language. The first one is the perceived perceived appropriateness, which is kind of obvious. Register theory says that there is a suitable language for particular contexts. So if the users who interact with chatbots believe that there is a more suitable language, then that would influence how appropriate they believe that the language is. The second one is credibility. We believe that register variation may influence how users perceive the chatbot's competence and believability, as we saw in the previous literature review. So we're going to evaluate that too. Also, using register-specific language may enhance the user's feelings of being together, that the chatbot is there with them, for them. And this is called social presence. Social presence is also often associated with anthropomorphism in the literature. So we also, anthropomorphism is how human-like the chatbot is. So we believe that the register variation also influence chatbot's human likeness and the ability to project itself in the interaction as an individual. And finally, we believe that users' individual preferences regarding human-like interactions with bots may influence their preferences regarding chatbots' language use. They might prefer a more human-like, less human-like chatbot, and so we evaluate that too. All right, so these are the constructs that we're going to evaluate all during this research. So after defining what we want to evaluate, our next step was collecting the data in the tourism domain. So we performed this in 2 steps. In the first one, because we want to know how human would produce their language in the tourist information search scenario, I collected a corpus of conversations about tourism in Flagstaff. So we hired 3 tourist assistants from the Flagstaff Visitor Center, and we invite them to the lab to answer tourist questions through Facebook Messenger. And I went to the Flagstaff Visitor Center and I intercepted the tourists there, approximately 30 tourists participating in this data collection. And they asked their questions to the online tourist assistant, and we got the answers that the tourist assistant gave to them. We also collected questions to ask the tourist assistant using websites like Quora, TripAdvisor, and Google Maps. Now, because a register, when we compare register, we need to compare against another language produced in a different scenario, in a different context. I also selected a corpus of conversations that are available online that is called Daily Dialogue. And Daily Dialogue is a set of conversations that are crawled from websites for English as second language learning. And these mostly mimics face-to-face interactions. I selected only the ones that are about tourism and that involve some sort of customer service providers relationship, like a hotel concierge and the guest, that kind of conversations. And we're going to compare these to corporate. So the comparison, to make that comparison, we're going to use a step called perform a step called register characterization, and I follow the register analysis from Dr. Biber's book. And what is the register characterization? I want to know what is the typical language in both corpora that we selected. So I want to know what's the language used in FLG, what is the language used in Daily Dialogue, and whether they are different or not, because they are viewed in different contexts, they're produced in different contexts. We believe that there would be a difference in the patterns of language. We're going to evaluate that. So what I did, I selected the tourist assistants utterances in FLG, the conversations in FLG, and then the data from the Daily Dialogue, and I submitted these to these Tagger. This is just a software developed by Dr. Biber and team. And what this Tagger does, it tags all the features, the linguistic features that are in those texts. For example, this is a noun, this is a verb, this is a pronoun, and so on and so forth. And it gives me the tagged files, but it also gives me the CSV files. And this CSV has the counts for each feature. So for each conversation, there will be a number that tells me how many of those kind of features. So for example, how many nouns we're going to have for that conversation if it was 10,000 words. So it's a normalized count. And then it also has 5 dimension scores. And these dimension scores are aggregation of linguistic features. And that tells me what is the prevailing characteristic of the register. There are 5 dimensions. We're going to talk about them. And then we perform the statistical analysis that I'm going to show the results now. So I started the register analysis looking at the dimensions. So what I did here for us to understand these dimensions is that I placed these lines here. This is just from Dr. Biber's book. And this is the range of dimension scores that we see per dimension. Okay, so let's see, for example, dimension 1, it ranges from -20 to +35 in Dr. Biber's book with the registers that Dr. Biber's analyzed. So what I did, I calculated the mean scores for our data, which is FLG and daily dialogue, and I placed them here so then we can see the difference in this dimension scores. So what we can see here is that for dimension 1, daily dialogue has a much larger number than FLG, which is all the way close to 0. What that tells me, that daily dialogue is more personally involved and interactive than FLG is, which is more focused on providing the information, and that's it. For dimension 2, we didn't find difference in the dimension scores, because they are both are descriptive. They are giving information, they're not really telling stories, so that makes sense. In the dimension 3, we see that FLG is more elaborate and more precise. Tourist assistants try to be more precise about the language, about the information that they're giving. And in daily dialogue, they shared more common ground of what is happening in the situation, so they didn't use the language that is so specific, so precise as in the FLG. In dimension 4 is about how persuasive the language is, and both FLG and dialogue were sort of conservative in terms of not giving too strong opinions and arguments. And in dimension 5, we see that daily dialogue is in the positive side, while FLG is in the negative side, which means daily dialogue is more formal and technical, and FLG is more informal. Now, when we look at these dimension scores, we kind of can understand the overall register characteristic, but we cannot know what particular linguistic features are influencing these results. So what I did, I went ahead and I evaluated every single linguistic feature that composed those dimensions, and I compared them, FLG with daily dialogue, to see what we got. And this is what I got as a result. So we have here 24 linguistic features that significantly varies across corpora. So between FLG, at least one tour guide and tourist assistant in FLG and daily dialogue. So in this plot, we're going to focus on the red and blue dots now. So these red dots are the mean of the counts for this particular feature, private verbs. Private verbs are verbs like think or believe, that sort of verbs. And here what we see is that we have the mean score for the tourist assistants in FLG, and we have the mean score for the service providers in daily dialogue. And this difference here is significant, okay? This is for all the features in this image. So what we can tell here is that tourist assistant use a lot less private verbs or that deletion or contractions or present verbs and so on and so forth than the service providers in daily dialogue. And we also can tell, for example, that they use more third-person pronouns or prepositions or nouns. Okay, so this is what we can see here. So there is a difference in the patterns of language between these two corpora. What we don't know, though, is what would happen if we have the FLG content being expressed with daily dialogue patterns of language. We don't know that. So what this first step gave us, in the first step in the analysis that gave us, is the core linguistic feature does vary. The register of these two corpora does vary, but we don't know what happens if we have one language in the other situation. And to do that, we need to use that parallel corpora that I mentioned at the beginning. So there's a process in the linguistic that is called text modifications. Text modifications are when you rephrase a sentence using different words without changing the meaning. And this was the goal of this next step. We want to rephrase the sentences in FLG to make it to have the patterns of language expressed in daily dialogue. Okay, so what I did, I got these sentences. I first cloned FLG, so now I have both. I have two. I'll keep FLG as it is, and I'll have this new data news corpora called FLG mod, and I'll perform all the modifications over this corpora. So imagine that I have a sentence here from FLG, and there's this sentence there, these words, there are always. And I have to increase the numbers, the counts for first person pronouns and present verbs. So what I did, I changed this. I wrote a Python script that changed there are always with we always have, and then I'm increasing here the first person pronouns and the present verbs. Now, I made several hundreds of these modifications, and I compared FLG mod, the new corpora, against daily dialogue, and I stopped making modifications when I got non-significant results. So what I did at the end, now we can look at the green dots. What I did was to approximate the red to the blue. So these green dots here are the mean counts for the FLG mod corpus, and we can see that it is much closer than much closer to the blue one than the red ones are, and these differences are not statistically different. Now, what we can tell, looking at this, we can tell that the distribution of features is the same between, is similar between daily dialogue and FLG mod. What we don't know if we were successful in keeping the content the same meaning. So what we did, we performed a user study and invited users to tell us if we preserve the content and if the sentences are still natural. Okay, so we selected 54 question answer pairs from FLG and FLG mod. And we recruited 88 participants from Prolific Platform, which is an online platform for recruitment. And we asked these participants to answer these questionnaires. And if the questionnaire we have questions for content preservation, where we show the question and two answers. One of them were FLG, the other one was FLG mod. And we asked them to select in this slide the rate for how similar the content is. And for naturalness, we showed one question and one single response, either from FLG or FLG mod, and we asked them to evaluate how natural it was using Likert scale. And then we statistically analyzed the results. So what we got is that for content preservation, I fit a intercept only model, where what I want to know is whether the scores, the estimated scores for content preservation is above 75, which is the upper quartile. And it turns out it is. The scores were estimated to be around 86. Even if we consider the confidence intervals, we would be in 84, which is reasonably above 75. So we're good with the content preservation. And then for the naturalness, we compared the Likert score using cumulative link model for ordinal data, which is going to tell me whether participants are more likely to give higher scores to one sentence than another, from one corpus than another. And as we can see in this plot, these differences are not really big, and it turns out they're not significant. So, and we have a lot more positive scores than negative scores. So what we can tell now is that we do have two parallel data, FLG and FLG mod. FLG is the original data, FLG mod is the modified data that has similar patterns of language. The distribution of the features is similar to daily dialogue, And we were successful in preserving the content and the naturalness of the sentences. So we can go ahead and perform our user study. Okay, so for the user study, we performed two studies. The first one, we wanted to investigate how the differences in register impacts the user perceptions and their experiences with the chatbots. So what we did, we again selected 54 question answer pairs from FLG and FLG mod. And we invited 178 participants from Prolific, and we also recruited 12 participants from an EU community to perform this study. The participants from the EU community, they perform exactly the same study that the online participants did, but we invited them to come to the lab, and we performed a think aloud session where they could tell us why they were choosing each of these responses. So they could give us some reasoning behind their choices. And the questionnaire was had 3 parts. All of the 3 parts are the same in terms of questions. So we give them a question and then 2 possible answers again. One of the answers from FLG, the other from FLG mod. And there was a third option, which is a I don't know. And this I don't know is just in case participants, because I don't prefer any, whatever, they are both okay. So they could choose the I don't know option. And they answer sort of a series of these preferences. They choose a series of these answers for each of these 3 constructs. So we evaluated here the appropriateness of language. They choose which one is the most appropriate, the most credible, and then the one that would provide the better user experience, the most satisfactory interaction. And then we got the results and statistically analyzed that. So for the statistical analysis in this case, we performed a generalized linear model. We wrote an algorithm, cross-validation algorithm with 10 folds, where we have 2 possible predictions, class of predictions. Participants prefer original sentences, which is 0, and participants prefer the modified version, which is 1. And to predict the outcomes, we selected a set of inputs, and these inputs were first the difference between FLG and FLG mod for each linguistic feature that we manipulated in our evaluation, in our register text modification in the previous step. So what we have here, for example, is so consider private verbs for a particular sentence. The count was 31, and then we modified it to be 62 because we have to increase private verbs. So what we input in the model is actually -31. So for this sentence, there is a difference between the 2 sentences that they would compare, and this sentence is -31. That's the rate. We also input in the model variables that characterize the individuals that were the interlocutors. So we added the authors of the original FLG answers, and because one might be better than the other in providing information, maybe. And we have the participants' identification and self-assessed social agent orientation, if they like to interact with chatbots or not. So they answered a profiling question when we got those responses, and we put everything that's in the model. Now, first thing we need to know to analyze this is whether our model is powerful enough to predict whether participants would choose original or modified. So we performed some metrics analysis, and we compared against the baseline model. A baseline model, just consider that original is better because participants chose original most of the time, okay? So if participants choose original most of the time, then I can assume that they will always choose original, okay? So this is what the baseline does. It always predicts the participants who choose original. And our model, our generalized linear model, is actually trying to decide if they're going to choose original or modified. And when we see this accuracy plot, we see that our model is not doing a lot better than the baseline. It has better scores, but it's not very much different. But this kind of makes sense because indeed participants choose original quite a few times. So baseline will get it right a lot of times. But then when we look at the AEC values, which actually tells me if the model can distinguish between the two classes, what is original, what is modified, we see that our model is actually doing a very good job. So what we can see here, what this tells us is actually, I cannot just assume original is better and participants will prefer original. There is something going on in the variables that I input in the model that is helping me to predict what the participants will choose, and I want to know which ones are there. So we looked at the coefficients. And what we see here, and I'm highlighting it here in red for each of the three constructs that we saw, is that all the variables that were selected as predictors of user choices are actually linguistic features. None of the variables that represent individual characteristics were selected as relevant variables in our model. So what is predicting the user choices in this case are actually the linguistic features and the register characteristics that we modified in the data. So that's pretty exciting. What we got here is that the use of register-specific language had a significant impact on user perceptions of the chatbots for the constructs we analyzed: language appropriateness, credibility, and user experience. And the effect of language was stronger than the individual characteristics, personal characteristics of the interlocutors. Okay, but in this study that we performed, the participants were seeing the question and answers side by side. They're not actually interacting with the chatbot. And we believe that could change something, right? So we want to know what happens if we actually ask the participants to interact with the chatbot and see and evaluate that particular interaction with that patterns of language, if that would change something. So we performed this second study where we developed this study page and we added a chatbot here. And all this study will be performed in this chatbot dialog box. And what is going on here is that we have two chatbots that is going to answer the tourists here, one at a time, of course. And one of them is FLG, and the other one is FLG mod. So when participants click in this link, it actually opens this page here, which is the dialog box. And we give the participants a script, which are actually questions that the tourists asked the tourist assistants. They just have to copy these questions, paste here, get an answer. They're going to pass the second one and get an answer, pass the other one, get an answer. When they ask all the 6 questions, they would be invited to answer a questionnaire that actually evaluates that particular chatbot. When the questionnaire is over, then the participant will be introduced to the second chatbot, and they're going to repeat the interaction, and they're going to repeat the evaluation for the second chatbot. 34 participants were recruited through Prolific again to perform this study, and we evaluated the perceived appropriateness of language, credibility, social presence, anthropomorphism, and overall user experience. And for this study, we performed an analysis in 2 steps. The first one, we want to actually compare the scores between FLG and FLG mod. So we want to know if participants are more likely to give higher rates for those constructs for one or another chatbot. And in the second evaluation, we want to know whether the appropriateness of language can be considered a predictor of the other variables. So we performed this partial least square model to evaluate the path between these variables. Okay, so what I got in the first step, where we compare the scores the participant gave, the Likert scores, again, I fit a cumulative link model for ordinal data, which tells me how likely the participants are to give higher scores to one chatbot than the other. And it tells me that is an increase in the odds of an outcome. So participants actually rate FLG, which is the original data, better than FLG mod. And we also looked at which constructs are actually determining this difference. And we see that the appropriateness of language is one. So participants actually believe that FLG, the original data, is more appropriate than the modified one. And the original data is actually more credible as well, which confirms what we saw in the first user study. And it shows us that social presence is also significant. So participants are more likely to tell that FLG is more socially present than FLG mod. Okay, but then anthropomorphism and user experience were not significant. Hold to that, I'll discuss that in the next slide. So what we see here for the second step, which is the path analysis. So what we're trying to see here is whether appropriateness helps to predict the other variables. So we're looking at these effect sizes here. And actually, I bootstrap everything to get the p-values and all that information that we need. They are all here in this table. And what we can tell from this is that appropriateness does influence the credibility. It is a predictor for credibility. Using appropriate language, it is a predictor of social presence. And appropriateness of language mediated through social presence. When you got better social presence, we also increase the levels of anthropomorphism. This effect was also significant. Now, none of the effects to user experience was significant. And when I look into this closely, we're going to see that we have a very strong effect size here. And this effect size is negative. And what we can tell about this is that the negative effect of anthropomorphism in the user experience might be suppressing the effect of the positive effect of the other variables. And this is a phenomenon that is known in the literature as uncanny effect. Uncanny. I think that's how to pronounce it. Whatever. So the uncanny effect actually tells that people have bad feelings when they are interacting with an artificial agent, but the artificial agent is overly humanized. So what we got from our studies is that participants in the in lab sessions, they said, well, it's cool when the chatbot says, we have restaurants, because when it says we, it's part of the tourist assistant community. So it's part of something bigger. We learned that. But participants don't like that the chatbots say, I would go to the Grand Canyon. And so you do not, you're a robot and not gonna go to the Grand Canyon. So there are some linguistic features that our tourist assistants use that might not be appropriate for a chatbot to use. And this, when we used a register appropriate language based on human-human communications, that made people believe that the chatbot could be too much humanized, and it provoked this negative effect, this uncanny effect. So we believe that this must be further addressed in the future steps. Okay, so this study concludes that using register-specific language does increase the perceptions of appropriateness, credibility, and social presence. And it also highlights that the levels of anthropomorphism may be suppressing the positive effect on the user experiences. So we need to care about how to convey the artificial identity of the chatbots when we use language. So we didn't stop that, because we built this parallel data and performed all these comparisons using one data set, which is daily dialogue. So it's one different register from the one we were using. And we wondered what would happen if we had this third register. It would be the same, it would confirm our results or not. So we replicated the first user study for another corpus to compare with. So we selected a corpus that is called Frames, and Frames is also available online. It's also about the tourism information. It's not actually information search, it's information making, because they are actually selling packages, travel packages. So you book a hotel, you book flights. So there's a lot of decision making in the process, which makes the language different from the ones we have. So I performed all the steps again, from the register analysis to the text modification, and I created this third parallel data, which I called FLG mod 2. And I repeated the user study 1 with this other data set. So everything again, I selected the 54 question answer pairs. I recruited 145 participants through Prolific, and I gave them a question, 2 answers, I don't know option, and then I give this 3 constructs for they evaluated one at a time, and I statistically analyzed the results using the same algorithm, cross-validation algorithm. It confirmed that the performance metrics were all good. So I could go ahead and look at the coefficients to see what were the variables that this model would select. And it turns out it did select only the linguistic features again, and not the individual characteristics of the participants. So it did confirm the inferences we got from the first user study. Also, some linguistic features that we manipulated in both studies, we got the same results. Like saying it confirmed the interpretations we gave for why the participants like that feature or don't like that feature were confirmed for this study. There are 2 features that were not confirmed that had contradicting results from the first study and this one. But then when we looked into it, we noticed that Frames and daily dialogue actually use those features in a different way, and participants like one of them and not the other one. So an example is that participants didn't like when the chatbot says, I would go to the Grand Canyon, for example. So the rates of would were very low. Participants don't like when they use low, and this might be influenced by the first person pronoun that is associated with the would. But in the frames, when we made the modifications to mimic frames, they are not saying those. They're saying, for example, campgrounds grounds will open soon. So the will, which is actually a prediction model again, is the same feature, but a different word, conveyed this better perception in the users. So they actually like that. So we noticed that we can understand better how participants like or why they like or not that particular feature. And some features we didn't evaluate in the first scenario, we had the chance to evaluate here, which also is positive in terms of why we replicated the study. Now we have a better coverage of what features are important for the user perceptions. Okay, so our research question was, how does a chatbot use of register appropriate language affect the user perceptions and experiences with chatbots? And we can tell, looking at the studies that we have, that the user perceptions of the experience with chatbots are indeed influenced by the chatbot's ability to use appropriate language, and that influence mainly how appropriate the language is. Participants do care about it, and how credible and how socially present the chatbot is. We also could show that register theory can be used as a theoretical foundation for chatbot's language design, because when we analyzed the register characteristics of the data, we could understand what participants and explain what participants like or dislike some kinds of features. And that was very interesting and gave us a very good starting point for the next steps. We also show that register analysis help us to identify the register characteristics, and that could be used in domains other than tourism. So people who want to use the outcomes from this research, and they are developing tourist chatbots, they could directly use the outcomes that we have. But people that are using for developing chatbots in a different domain, they may want to use the methodology that we use here to identify the prevailing register characteristics in a different domain and then follow from that. We also observed that we need to fine-tune the register that we identified to balance the levels of anthropomorphism, because this is going to help to improve the user perceptions of their experiences. And as a final contribution, we also developed all these parallel data, and we're making this data available online for other researchers and practitioners who want to use this data to perform natural language research or development. So moving next, what we believe that we need to do to develop the next generation of chatbots is to develop new methods to perform automatic text modification and not manually, evaluate how extensible is the outcomes that we got from this research to similar domains where the context doesn't change much, but it's not tourism. We observed the importance of evaluate co-occurring features, because in our study, we analyzed the linguistic features one at a time, isolated. And we believe it's important to look at how they are placed in the sentence and more specific aspects of how they co-occur. That we have a algorithm, the cross-validation algorithm that we used. It actually, giving this sentence, it tells me what the user will prefer, but we didn't find in the literature a similar method that, giving what the user wants, select or rank the candidate sentences to select as the most appropriate one. So this is an open challenge that we believe is going to be very important to develop the next generation of chatbots. And finally, we need to fine-tune the register to balance the levels of anthropomorphism, as I discussed before. So that concludes my talk. I thank you all again for being here today. It's very special for me. And I'll be happy to take any questions.